The city skyline was still glowing when Jonathan Hale dismissed his driver outside the towering glass building where his board meeting was supposed to take place. He had stared at his calendar, then at his own reflection in the tinted window of the car, and something inside him whispered, "Not tonight." For years his life had been a carousel of numbers, polished suits, and dinners filled with deals. But on this night, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he longed for quiet, for the comfort of his own home, the feel of space untainted by business chatter. The mansion greeted him the way it always did, gates opening silently, a driveway stretching under a canopy of lights, the kind of grandeur that impressed anyone who saw it for the first time. Jonathan stepped out of the car and let himself into the house, expecting the usual. The low hum of Vivian's voice on the phone, the faint clink of glasses, or at least the rhythm of music drifting from the sitting room. But instead he was met with stillness. It was the kind of silence that doesn't soothe but unsettles. He set his keys on the marble console and paused. The house felt different tonight, as though the air itself was holding its breath. His polished shoes clicked against the floor, echoing into the vastness of the hallway. He told himself it was nothing, that Vivian had probably retired early, or Carmen, the maid, had taken her daughter upstairs. Yet as he moved deeper inside, he heard it, a sharp sound, not loud but distinct, the quick sting of a voice raised, followed by the dull scrape of something against the wall. Jonathan stopped, his brows knitting together. The sound carried down the corridor, sharp syllables that didn't belong in a place so carefully arranged for serenity. He followed it, each step slower than the last, a creeping suspicion tightening his chest. When he turned the corner, the world he thought he knew cracked. Vivian stood in the middle of the hallway, her hair perfect as ever, her silk robe flowing like she had just stepped out of a fashion shoot. But her face was twisted in something ugly, something he had never seen on her before. And in front of her, pressed against the wall with wide, terrified eyes, was Lana, 8 years old, Carmen's daughter. A child Jonathan had often seen darting shyly around the house, always clutching a book or hiding behind her mother's apron. Vivian's hand was on the girl's shoulder, shoving her back, not with the careless push of annoyance, but with deliberate force. Her voice was cutting, sharp enough to slice the air. "You little nuisance," Vivian hissed. "How many times have I told you not to touch things that don't belong to you?" Lana's lips trembled. Her small hands clutched the hem of her faded dress, knuckles white. She shook her head, barely whispering, "I didn't, ma'am." "I promise." Jonathan froze. His throat tightened, his body rooted to the spot. For a moment, he didn't believe what he was seeing. His wife, elegant, poised Vivian, the woman who hosted charity galas for children, towering over a frightened little girl with such venom in her eyes. The sound that had drawn him earlier was explained now. A shattered vase lay in pieces across the polished marble, its porcelain shards glittering beneath the chandelier. Lana's knees bore tiny scratches from where she had clearly fallen beside it. Vivian's grip tightened and Lana winced. Jonathan's heart thundered in his chest. His instinct screamed at him to step forward, to tear Vivian's hand away, to protect that child. Yet he remained still, breath caught between shock and anger. The silence of the mansion was no longer silent. It was charged, heavy like a storm about to break. For the first time, Jonathan saw his wife not as the charming socialite adored by the city's elite, but as something else entirely. And as his eyes locked on Lana's terrified face, one thought pierced through the chaos. This isn't the first time. And in that realization, Jonathan Hale felt his entire world shift. Jonathan stood frozen in the hallway long after the silence swallowed Vivian's last word. His pulse still pounded in his ears, drowning out the steady tick of the grandfather clock at the end of the corridor. He had built his life on control of his empire, his reputation, his household. Yet here in his own home, he felt that grip loosening, unraveling with each passing second. Vivian turned at last, her eyes flashing when she realized he was there. For the briefest moment, her mask faltered. Surprise flickered across her features like a thief caught mid-act. But then, just as quickly, she smoothed it over with that same polished composure she wore at charity galas. "Jonathan," she said, her voice lilting with practiced ease. "I didn't hear you come in." He didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on Lana, the little girl still pressed against the wall, her shoulders trembling. She looked up at him with eyes that begged for rescue but also carried something else, something heavier. A silence that spoke of secrets she dared not reveal. Vivian released the child's shoulder with a delicate flick, as though the contact had been accidental all along. She reached for the sash of her robe and cinched it tighter, stepping away from the broken vase. Clumsy little thing, she continued smoothly, her tone dipping into that casual condescension she so often reserved for servants. She knocked over the Ming vase. I was just correcting her. Jonathan's mouth felt dry. He knew that vase. It had been a gift from a foreign dignitary years ago, a piece Vivian liked to parade before their guests. But the value of porcelain meant nothing compared to the sight of a frightened child recoiling from his wife's hand. Still, he said nothing. His tongue felt leaden, trapped between disbelief and anger. Vivian smiled thinly, her eyes darting toward Lana. Go on, dear, she ordered with a sharp edge hidden under her velvet tone. Find your mother and tell her to clean this mess. And do be careful this time, Lana nodded quickly, too quickly, and scurried away, her small footsteps vanishing down the back corridor. The emptiness she left behind seemed louder than any scream. When Jonathan finally spoke, his voice came out low, almost foreign to him. What did I just see? Vivian laughed lightly, that silvery sound that had charmed half the city. Oh, darling, don't look so serious. You know how children are. They need discipline. Carmen spoils that girl, lets her wander about like she owns the place. Someone has to teach her boundaries. Jonathan studied her, really studied her, as though seeing her for the first time. The flawless skin, the diamond necklace resting casually at her throat, the perfect posture. All of it seemed like a costume now, a disguise draped over something much harsher. Discipline, he repeated slowly. His voice carried a weight that made Vivian's smile falter. She's 8 years old, Vivian, 8. Her eyes narrowed, but only slightly. She tilted her head, adopting that patient tone she used when explaining things to people she considered beneath her. And 8 is exactly the age they learn their place. Trust me, Jonathan. If Carmen can't do her job properly, then it falls on me. We can't have chaos in this house. Appearances matter. That word, appearances, landed like a stone in his chest. How many times had he heard her say it? At dinners, at fundraisers, in hushed whispers before interviews. Appearances. It had always been her religion. Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he forced his face to remain neutral. A war was breaking out inside him, rage on one side, denial on the other. He wanted to believe this was a single moment, a single lapse. Yet Lana's eyes had told him otherwise. Vivian reached out, her manicured fingers brushing his sleeve. Don't let this little incident spoil your night. Come, I'll pour you a drink, but Jonathan didn't move. His gaze lingered on the shards of porcelain scattered across the marble, tiny fragments reflecting the chandelier's light like broken stars. The vase wasn't the only thing shattered tonight. Something in his marriage and his perception of his wife had cracked too. And though he hadn't spoken the words aloud deep inside Jonathan Hale, a seed of suspicion took root, growing in the silence she left behind. Jonathan lingered in the hallway long after Vivian had glided away, her perfume trailing in the air like smoke after a fire. His eyes kept drifting back to the shattered porcelain on the floor, the glittering fragments like evidence of something far more fragile than art. A piece of trust, broken beyond repair. He finally forced himself to move, each step echoing against the marble as he made his way toward the servants' quarters. He had walked that path countless times, though never with this heaviness pressing on his chest. Tonight, the house felt like a maze of secrets, and every corner whispered of things he had failed to see. The faint sound of muffled crying guided him to the small kitchen near the back. He stopped before the doorway. Through the dim light, he saw her, Lana, curled on a wooden chair, her legs pulled up tight against her chest. Her small hands were clasped around her knees, and her chin rested on them as though she was trying to make herself disappear. Jonathan's heart clenched. Children weren't supposed to sit like that, not in fear, not in silence. He cleared his throat gently, not wanting to startle her. Lana, he said softly. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide, glistening with the remnants of tears. For a long moment, she just stared at him, frozen as if she didn't know whether to run or answer. He stepped into the room slowly, lowering his voice. It's all right, I wanted to see if you're hurt. Her lips parted, but no words came. She shook her head quickly, eyes darting toward the door as though expecting her mother or worse, Vivian, to appear. Jonathan lowered himself onto the chair across from her, a deliberate act of gentleness. He wasn't used to this. He commanded boardrooms, silenced rivals with a single look. But this was different. This was a child, and the usual weapons of power had no place here. "Your knee," he said quietly, pointing. "It looked like you fell." She glanced down at the small scratch, then tucked her legs closer, hiding it. "I'm okay," she whispered. Her voice was so faint it was almost swallowed by the hum of the refrigerator. Jonathan studied her, and the weight of realization pressed heavier on his chest. This wasn't just about a broken vase. The way she flinched, the way she guarded her words, the way she avoided his eyes, it all spoke of something more. Something learned over time. He leaned forward, lowering his tone even further.
"Lana, has this happened before?"
Her fingers dug into the fabric of her dress. Her small shoulders rose, then fell. She didn't nod, didn't shake her head. She just stared at the floor. That silence was louder than any confession. Jonathan's throat tightened. He wanted to promise her safety, to tell her nothing like this would ever happen again. But even as the words formed in his mind, he realized how hollow they might sound. Vivian wasn't a storm he could sweep away with a single sentence. Before he could say more, footsteps approached. Carmen appeared in the doorway, her apron still tied, worry etched across her tired face. She rushed to her daughter's side, pulling Lana close. "I told you not to sit out here," Carmen murmured, her voice trembling as she stroked her daughter's hair. She looked up at Jonathan, her eyes wide with a mixture of apology and fear. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll take her upstairs." Jonathan wanted to stop her, to demand answers, but something in Carmen's expression held him back. It was the same silence in Lana's eyes, only older, deeper, a silence born not of ignorance but of survival. As they slipped away, Jonathan sat in the dim kitchen, his hands resting uselessly on the table. The hum of the refrigerator filled the space again, but it didn't soothe him. It only reminded him how long he had lived in this house without hearing what truly mattered. And for the first time, Jonathan Hale wondered what else had been happening right under his roof, hidden in plain sight, behind the mask of his perfect life. The master bedroom smelled faintly of lavender and expensive perfume, a carefully curated atmosphere of calm. But when Jonathan walked past the door that night, there was nothing calm about what he heard. Vivian's voice carried through the crack in the door, sharper than he had ever heard it in public. On stage, at fundraisers, in front of journalists, her words were always dipped in honey. But here, in the privacy of their home, they were edged with steel. "I don't care what excuse she gives me," Vivian hissed into her phone. "That child is a nuisance. Always underfoot, always making a mess. Carmen ought to be grateful she even has a position in this house. Without me, she'd be scrubbing motel floors for pennies." Jonathan froze in the hallway, every syllable searing into him. There was a pause, and then Vivian's laughter rang out. Low, cruel, a sound he barely recognized. "Oh, please, don't be so dramatic. I'm not hurting the girl. I'm teaching her discipline. Children like that, children raised without proper breeding, they need to learn early where they belong. Otherwise, they grow up thinking they're equal to everyone else." Jonathan's jaw clenched, his hand tightening around the banister as if it could keep him grounded. The words didn't just reveal contempt, they revealed belief. This wasn't an outburst born of frustration. This was a worldview. Vivian's tone softened, a performative sweetness sliding back into place. "Of course Jonathan doesn't know. He's too busy playing savior at the office to notice what goes on here. And if he did see anything, he'd convince himself it was nothing. He always does. That's why it works." Those words landed like a knife to the gut. Jonathan had spent his career building a reputation as a man who missed nothing, a strategist who always saw 3 moves ahead. But in his own home, with his own wife, he had been blind. Inside the room, Vivian sighed theatrically. "The truth is, appearances are everything. People see what I show them. They applaud me at luncheons. They photograph me handing oversized checks to children's hospitals, and they believe every bit of it. They don't know, and they never will. That's the beauty of control. You give them the story, and they never bother to look for the truth." Jonathan felt something cold move through him. He had always admired Vivian's composure, the way she carried herself as if she were born to be admired. Now he realized that composure was nothing more than a mask polished so bright that even he, living beside her for years, had mistaken it for truth. She laughed again, softer this time. Besides, she whispered into the phone, it's not as if that little girl matters. Children like her are invisible. People forget them before they've even left the room. Jonathan backed away from the door, his breath shallow. For the first time in his marriage, he couldn't look at his wife without seeing something monstrous. He retreated down the hall, the words still echoing in his head. Invisible. Forgotten. But Lana's wide, terrified eyes refused to fade from his memory. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't forgettable. And if Vivian thought Jonathan would continue playing the blind husband, she was about to discover that the man she had underestimated for so long was finally awake. Jonathan didn't sleep that night. He lay awake in the guest room, a room he hadn't stepped into in years, staring at the ceiling while Vivian slept soundly down the hall, unaware that her carefully woven mask had slipped in front of the one man she thought would never see through it. By dawn, he could no longer keep still. He needed answers, and he knew only one person in the house carried them. The faint clatter of pots guided him toward the kitchen. The sun had barely risen, and Carmen was already at work, moving quietly as though afraid to disturb the silence. Her shoulders sagged under the weight of exhaustion, her hair pulled back hastily, her apron already streaked from a long day that hadn't even begun. She nearly dropped the pan in her hands when she saw him standing there. "Mr. Hale," she gasped softly, eyes darting toward the hallway as if to check if Vivian was behind him. "Carmen," Jonathan said gently, raising a hand. "It's just me." Her grip on the pan tightened, her knuckles pale. "Is there something you need?" Jonathan stepped further into the kitchen, lowering his voice. "I need the truth." Carmen stiffened, her gaze falling to the floor. "Sir?" He studied her carefully. This was not the woman he remembered hiring years ago. Quiet but proud, reliable and steady. This was someone smaller, worn down. Fear had shaped her posture. Fear had tightened her voice. "Last night," Jonathan said slowly, "I saw Vivian with your daughter." Carmen's breath hitched. The pan slipped from her hands, clattering against the stove. She bent quickly to steady it, but her trembling betrayed her. She didn't mean. Jonathan's voice hardened, though he kept it quiet. "Don't defend her. I need to know if this has happened before." Carmen froze. For a long, heavy moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. She's always been hard on Lana," Carmen whispered. "At first it was just words. Sharp words, cruel names. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself if I kept my head down, if I worked harder, it would stop." Jonathan felt his stomach knot. "But it didn't stop," Carmen continued, her hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her fingers shook. "It got worse. Little slaps, little shoves, punishments when she thought no one was looking. She says Lana needs to learn discipline, that I spoil her. She says if I complain, if I breathe a word of it, I'll be out on the street. And she's right, Mr. Hale, I can't afford to lose this job. Not with Lana." Her eyes finally met his, brimming with tears she had held back for years. "Do you know what it feels like? Watching someone treat your child that way and knowing you can't stop it? That you can't protect her because the roof over your heads depends on your silence." Jonathan's chest tightened. He had built an empire on contracts and negotiations, but here in his kitchen stood a woman whose entire life hinged on unspoken threats. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that Vivian had no right, that her threats meant nothing. But Carmen's face told him this wasn't just about threats. This was about power. Vivian had it and Carmen didn't. Jonathan swallowed hard, his voice low but firm. "Carmen, you and your daughter are not alone in this." Not anymore, her lips trembled. She wanted to believe him, he could see it in her eyes, but fear kept her tethered to silence. She shook her head quickly, whispering, "Please, don't say anything. She'll know it came from me." Jonathan leaned forward, his voice steady, resolute. "She already knows I saw her. And she's about to learn that this house is not hers to control. Not anymore." Carmen's tears slipped free, rolling down her cheeks as she pulled Lana closer. Lana had crept into the kitchen unnoticed, clutching the doorway with wide, watchful eyes. Jonathan met the child's gaze and, for the first time, spoke the promise aloud. "I won't let anyone hurt you again." And in that quiet kitchen, as the morning light spilled across the tiles, Jonathan Hale knew he could never go back to the man he had been. Something inside him had shifted. The blind husband was gone. In his place stood a man who would not look away again. Jonathan sat in his study that evening. the amber glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across stacks of papers he hadn't touched all day. His empire, spreadsheets, contracts, deals that stretched across continents, sat idle before him, irrelevant. His mind wasn't on business. It was replaying every detail of the last 24 hours, every word Carmen had confessed, every flinch he had seen in Lana's eyes. For years he had told himself that silence was peace. That as long as the house ran smoothly, as long as Vivian smiled for the cameras and the staff did their work without complaint, everything was fine. He thought order meant harmony, but now he realized that order had been nothing more than Vivian's control, and his silence had been her weapon. He leaned back in his leather chair, running a hand through his hair. Guilt pressed down on him like a weight he couldn't lift. He saw the broken vase, the fear in Lana's trembling frame, Carmen's tears in the morning light. And then other moments began to surface. Memories. He had ignored at the time the way Vivian once scolded Carmen in front of guests for serving wine a degree too warm. The time Lana had darted out of the living room, eyes wet, just before Vivian entered with her dazzling smile, pretending nothing had happened. The charity gala speeches where Vivian spoke of protecting children, while brushing off Jonathan's casual suggestion to donate more to the staff's families. He had thought nothing of it. He had chosen not to see, and now that blindness burned. He poured himself a drink, the ice clinking against the crystal, but the taste felt bitter. He pushed it aside untouched. A different fire was taking hold inside him. Anger, yes, but more than that, a fierce clarity. Jonathan rose and walked to the tall windows, pulling back the heavy drapes. Outside, the city glittered, 1,000 lights burning against the night. He wondered how many homes behind those lights held secrets like his own. How many children were silenced by power, by fear, by people who hid behind appearances. For the first time, Jonathan felt a responsibility that went beyond his wealth, beyond his name. This wasn't about business or reputation anymore. This was about truth, about stepping into a role he should have taken years ago. Protector, not just provider. A soft knock at the door pulled him back. It was the butler, old Thomas, his voice quiet with respect. "Sir, Mrs. Hale is expecting you in the dining room." Jonathan's jaw tightened. The thought of sitting across from Vivian, of watching her play the perfect hostess while he now knew the venom behind her words, it made his stomach twist. But he nodded anyway. "Tell her I'll be there shortly." When the door closed, Jonathan stayed by the window, staring at the city below. He knew he couldn't confront Vivian openly, not yet. She was cunning, always 3 steps ahead in social maneuvering. If he moved too soon, she would twist the story, turn her lies into truth, and Carmen and Lana would pay the price. No, this wasn't about a burst of anger. It would take patience, precision. He had built an empire on strategy, and now for the first time he would use that same skill against his own wife. He whispered to himself, the words steady, certain, no more silence. And in that moment, Jonathan Hale, the man who had once mistaken appearances for reality, made his choice. He would expose Vivian, strip away the mask she wore so easily, and show the world the cruelty she hid. But more than that, he would protect the 2 people who had been invisible in his own house for 2. Long Carmen. Lana, they would no longer live in fear. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers that spilled, golden light across marble floors and mirrored walls. It was the kind of evening Vivian lived for. Cameras flashing, voices rising in admiration, the city's most powerful names gathered under one roof. Her gown flowed like liquid silver, every jewel on her wrists and ears catching the light, every step rehearsed to perfection. Jonathan walked beside her, his tuxedo pressed, his expression unreadable. To anyone watching, they were the perfect couple, the millionaire and his elegant wife, hosts of a night devoted to children's futures. But beneath the polish, Jonathan's chest tightened with every smile Vivian gave, every hand she shook, every speech dripping with the hypocrisy he now saw for what it was. He stood quietly as she floated across the room, adored by the crowd. They whispered her name as though she were royalty. They praised her charity fund, her tireless work for children, her kindness. And Jonathan saw how effortlessly she deceived them all. When she finally took the stage, applause filled the hall. Vivian's voice rose, smooth as silk, confident as ever. "Tonight," she said, spreading her arms as if to embrace them all, We gather not just as patrons but as protectors of the most precious resource we have, our children. Jonathan's throat tightened. He remembered Lana's eyes, wide with fear, her whispered, "I didn't, ma'am. I promise." He remembered Carmen's trembling hands, her confession spoken in a whisper. And now, here was Vivian, praised as a guardian of children while the truth lay hidden behind the polished glass of appearances. The crowd erupted in applause. Cameras clicked. Vivian smiled that dazzling smile, her mask so perfect that no one questioned it. No one but Jonathan. He stayed at the edge of the crowd, his drink untouched in his hand, his eyes fixed on her. He saw every flicker in her expression, every calculated pause in her speech. And for the first time he realized how deep her performance ran. This wasn't just a facade for society. This was her power, her weapon. But Jonathan was no longer blind. As the applause swelled again, he slipped away from the center of the room. He found himself in the quiet of the balcony, city lights stretching out before him. He pulled his phone from his pocket and scrolled to the message thread he had opened earlier that week. The investigator had already sent him a file. Evidence quietly gathered. Testimonies whispered from staff who had once worked under Vivian. Silent witnesses who now found their voices. And Jonathan had recordings too. Words Vivian had spoken when she thought she was unobserved. Proof of who she truly was. His thumb hovered over the file. He wasn't ready to unleash it yet. Not tonight. Timing mattered. Strategy mattered. Behind him, the glass doors opened. Vivian stepped out, her gown trailing like moonlight, her smile poised even in the intimacy of shadows. "Darling," she purred, sliding her hand onto his arm. "Why so serious? The evening is a triumph." Jonathan looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in years he felt nothing, not admiration, not pride, not even anger. Just resolve. He smiled faintly, masking his thoughts as easily as she masked hers. "Yes," he said evenly, "a triumph." But in his mind, a different triumph was taking shape. Not hers, his. The world saw Vivian Hale as untouchable. Soon they would see her as she truly was. And Jonathan would make sure of it. The storm began quietly, not with thunder but with whispers. Jonathan sat in his office late one evening, the city lights flickering beyond the glass. On his desk lay a slim black folder, the kind he used to review high-stakes contracts. But this wasn't numbers or mergers. It was evidence, testimonies, patterns of cruelty, a record of Vivian's private empire of control. He opened his phone, scrolling to a name he hadn't contacted in months. Daniel Rhodes, an old college friend turned civil rights lawyer. Jonathan hesitated for a moment, then pressed call. "Jonathan Hale." Daniel's voice came after 2 rings, warm but wary. "To what do I owe the surprise?" Jonathan didn't waste time. "I need your help, quietly. It's about Vivian." There was silence on the line. Then a careful, "Go on." Jonathan told him everything, not in dramatic bursts, but in measured detail, each word heavy with the weight of guilt. He spoke of Lana, of Carmen's trembling confession, of the phone call he had overheard, of the mask Vivian wore in public while terrorizing a child behind closed doors. By the time he finished, Jonathan's throat was raw. Daniel exhaled slowly. "That's not just cruelty, Jonathan. That's abuse. And if half of what you're saying is true, it needs to come out." "I know," Jonathan said quietly. "But it can't come from me alone. If I move too soon, she'll twist it. She'll make me the enemy. Make them, Carmen and Lana, look like liars. I need this airtight." "You'll have it," Daniel promised. "I'll bring in people I trust, discreetly. But Jonathan, this is going to cost you more than money. When this comes out, Vivian will burn the ground she stands on to protect herself." Jonathan's gaze drifted to the city beyond the glass, the empire he had built. He thought of the magazines that had crowned them a power couple, of the flawless photos taken in this very house. And then he thought of Lana's small, shaking shoulders. "Then let her burn," he said. "I'm done being silent." At home, Vivian moved through the days with her usual elegance, but Jonathan began to notice cracks in the mask. The sharp way she scolded Carmen when she thought he wasn't listening. The tightness in her smile when donors praised Jonathan instead of her. The glances she cast his way, quick, searching, as if she sensed something shifting beneath his calm exterior. One night over dinner, she leaned in across the candlelight, her tone sugar-sweet. You've been distant, darling. Distracted. Is there something I should know? Jonathan met her gaze evenly, his face unreadable. Just work. Her smile lingered, but her eyes hardened for a fraction of a second. It was enough to confirm what he already knew. Vivian was watching him. And if she suspected his loyalty wavered, she would strike first. Later that night, Jonathan passed by the servants' corridor and paused. Lana's soft voice drifted from her small room, reading aloud from a storybook. Carmen sat beside her, head bowed, the exhaustion of the day written in her posture. For a moment, Jonathan stood there unseen, listening to the child's voice. Something inside him shifted again, heavier this time. Not just resolve, but responsibility. Protecting them wasn't charity. It was duty. He turned away quietly, his decision clear. The storm was coming. And when it broke, Vivian's mask would shatter for the world to see. The dinner was supposed to be another of Vivian's glittering triumphs. The long oak table gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, every plate set with precision, every glass filled with imported wine. Around it sat the city's elite, investors, politicians, socialites, each of them laughing a little too loudly at Vivian's practiced charm. Jonathan, however, was not laughing. He sat at the head of the table, his posture calm, his voice measured, but his mind was elsewhere. He had chosen every guest carefully tonight. Among the usual names Vivian adored courting were a few new faces, Daniel Rhodes among them, introduced politely as an old friend, and two others Jonathan had brought discreetly, allies who specialized in investigative work, seated quietly near the end of the table observing. Vivian thrived under the glow of attention. Her gown was emerald silk, her words sweet, her laughter the loudest in the room. She dazzled as she always did. But Jonathan noticed the flicker in her eyes whenever his gaze lingered too long. She sensed something. She just didn't know what. Between courses, she placed her hand delicately on his arm, her voice pitched low. "You're awfully quiet tonight, Jonathan. Are you well?" Jonathan smiled faintly, masking the storm beneath. "Just watching." Her eyes narrowed, but she returned to her performance. When dessert arrived, Jonathan rose to his feet, raising his glass. The table hushed. Jonathan Hale was not a man who made speeches lightly. "I want to thank you all for coming," he began, his tone steady, deliberate. "We often gather to celebrate success, to toast to appearances, to polish what is already shining. But I've come to realize something. What truly matters is not what's visible in the light, but what happens in the shadows when no one is watching." The words hung heavy in the air. Vivian's smile froze, though she kept it fixed. Jonathan continued, his eyes sweeping the table. "I've spent years believing silence was peace. That if a house looked perfect, it must be. I was wrong. Silence isn't peace, it's permission. And too often that permission hides cruelty." A ripple went through the room. Guests exchanged curious glances, uncertain. Vivian's laugh rang out, brittle and quick. "Darling, you're being poetic again." She turned to the table, forcing her smile wider. "My husband has a dramatic streak." Jonathan's eyes locked on hers. For the briefest moment he saw the mask crack. He raised his glass higher. "I don't say this to unsettle anyone. I say it because truth matters more than appearances. And soon, very soon, the truth will speak for itself." The silence that followed was sharp, a tension no one could ignore. Guests murmured, some nodding, some puzzled. Vivian's fingers tightened around her glass, her knuckles pale against the stem. Jonathan sat down slowly, calm as stone. Around him the dinner resumed, but the energy had shifted. The allies at the far end of the table exchanged a glance. Daniel's eyes met Jonathan's, steady, approving. The trap was nearly ready. Vivian, however, was already plotting. He could see it in the rigid tilt of her chin, the way her smile never touched her eyes again that night. She knew something was coming. And like a cornered animal, she would strike. Jonathan lifted his fork, unhurried, even as his heart pounded. The game was in motion, and this time, Vivian would not win. The night of the reckoning came without fanfare. Vivian had arranged another charity gala, her grandest yet. The ballroom glowed with gold and white, cameras flashing as she glided across the stage in a gown meant to dazzle. The theme was "Every Child Matters." The irony was almost unbearable. Jonathan stood at the edge of the crowd, his jaw tight, his hands clasped behind his back. Beside him, Daniel and the investigators waited in silence. Carmen and Lana had been ushered into a private room nearby, shielded from the spectacle. Tonight wasn't about appearances, it was about truth. Vivian began her speech, her voice smooth as silk. "Children," she said, "are the most fragile treasures we have. It is our duty to protect them, to nurture them, to give them every chance to flourish." Applause erupted. She smiled, poised and radiant. Cameras flashed. The perfect performance. Jonathan felt the weight of his phone in his pocket, the recordings, the evidence. He took a slow breath and moved forward. When she finished her speech, he was already at the stage. The room fell into a hush as he stepped beside her, microphone in hand. "My wife speaks beautifully," Jonathan said, his voice steady. "But sometimes beauty hides the truth, and the truth deserves to be seen." Vivian's smile flickered. "Jonathan," she said lightly, her voice strained. "This isn't the time, and it's exactly the time," he cut in. His thumb pressed the screen of his phone. The ballroom filled with her voice, not the polished one everyone knew, but the one he had heard through a cracked door. "That child is a nuisance. Children like that, children raised without proper breeding, they need to learn where they belong." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Another clip followed. "People see what I show them. They don't know and they never will. That's the beauty of control. You give them the story and they never bother to look for the truth." The room fell silent but for the echo of her own words. Cameras swiveled from Vivian's frozen face to Jonathan's steady one. Whispers rose, sharp and horrified. Vivian's mask shattered. She reached for Jonathan, her voice cracking. "This is twisted, taken out of context," but Jonathan's eyes were steel. "Context doesn't turn cruelty into compassion. It doesn't erase a child's fear. You speak of protecting children while breaking one in your own home." Her breath came fast, desperate now. "You'll destroy us both, our reputation, our name." Jonathan's voice cut through, clear and resolute. "A name built on lies deserves to fall." The room erupted. Some guests turned away, others demanded answers. The cameras caught everything, her stunned face, his unyielding stance. Security stepped in, not for Jonathan but for Vivian, as reporters surged forward. She stumbled, her gown dragging, her voice lost beneath the roar of outrage. Jonathan turned from the chaos, his eyes finding Daniel's across the room. The lawyer gave a single nod. The evidence was already in safe hands. Minutes later, Jonathan walked into the quiet side room where Carmen and Lana waited. Lana's eyes were wide, uncertain. Carmen clutched her daughter's hand, bracing for bad news. Jonathan knelt before them, his voice soft but sure. "It's over. She can't hurt you again." For the first time, Carmen's shoulders sagged, not from exhaustion but from release. Tears slipped silently down her face. Lana stepped forward, her small hand brushing Jonathan's. "You stopped her?" she whispered. Jonathan's chest tightened. He took her hand gently in his. "I promised I would." The sounds of the collapsing gala echoed faintly in the distance, but here, in this quiet room, something else rose, the fragile beginning of safety. Jonathan knew the road ahead would not be simple. Vivian would fight. The scandal would shake his world. And nothing about the future was certain. But one thing was clear. He was no longer blind. He had chosen truth over silence, protection over appearances. And as he looked at Carmen and Lana, he knew this was the first step toward building a home where fear no longer lived. The mask was gone. The storm had passed, and in its place there was light.